In 1909, a newspaper in Arizona printed a story that should have rewritten everything we think we know about the Grand Canyon. It described a hidden cavern carved deep into the canyon walls, hundreds of feet above the river. Inside, according to the report, were artifacts that did not belong to any people who had ever been recorded living in North America, Egyptian-style statues. Eastern idols sitting cross-legged in carved alcoves. Long hallways cut with a precision that nobody at the time could explain. The man who supposedly found it was said to be working under the Smithsonian Institution. And then, almost as quickly as the story appeared, it disappeared. No follow-up, no correction, no surviving record of the explorer who found it. The whole thing was quietly walked back into the dark, and most history books act like it never happened at all. But the strangest part of this story has very little to do with that 1909 article. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. It has to do with the people who lived inside that canyon for centuries before any newspaper reporter ever set foot near it. The Havasupai, the people of the blue-green water. And it has to do with something their elders reportedly refused to speak about to outsiders, generation after generation, right up until the year 1894. So today we are going to walk through this slowly. The article, the names carved onto the canyon's own map, the oral traditions, and the much larger theory that ties all of it together. Some of it is documented, some of it is legend, and some of it sits in that uncomfortable space in between where the official story and the local story have never quite agreed. Let's start where most people start, and then go somewhere most people never do. To understand why any of this matters, you have to understand what the Grand Canyon actually is to the Havasupai. They did not discover it. They did not migrate to the rim and build a lookout. By their own accounts, and by the accounts of the tribes around them, they have always been there. The canyon is not scenery to them, it is the center of the world. Their villages sit beside waterfalls so blue they look digitally altered, fed by mineral water that paints the stone with bands of turquoise. For most of their history, the only way in was a narrow trail down the cliffs, single file, hugging the rock. It was the kind of place that kept its secrets simply by being almost impossible to reach. When the United States government drew its lines across the territory in the late 19th century, the Havasupai were confined to a sliver of that land. A people who had ranged across plateaus and side canyons for as long as anyone could remember were suddenly told to stay inside a few hundred acres at the bottom of a gorge. And that timing matters, because it placed the tribe directly in the path of the surveyors, the ethnographers, and the curiosity seekers who began pouring into the region in those exact years. The 1880s and 1890s were when outsiders started writing the canyon down, mapping it, naming it, and asking the people who lived there what they knew. Here is the first detail that tends to stop people cold, and it is not a rumor. It is printed on official maps to this day. Scattered across the interior of the Grand Canyon are towering rock formations, isolated buttes and pinnacles, and a remarkable number of them carry names borrowed from ancient religions on the other side of the planet. There is a formation called Isis Temple. There is one called Osiris Temple. There is the Tower of Set and the Tower of Ra. There is Horus Temple and Cheops Pyramid. Walk the map a little further, and you find Buddha Temple and Buddha Cloister, Shiva Temple, Vishnu Temple, Brahma Temple, Manu Temple. There is Zoroaster Temple, named for the Persian prophet. There is Confucius Temple and Mencius Temple sitting near each other, as if someone were sorting the world's philosophies by neighborhood. And there is Wotan's throne, pulled from old Germanic myth. And it is not a handful of names. It is the dominant theme of the entire map. Stand at a good overlook and the great isolated buttes rising from the canyon floor read almost like a pantheon assembled from every corner of the ancient world. The Egyptian cluster sits in one region. The Hindu and Buddhist names gather in another. The Norse and the Chinese and the Persian fill in the gaps. A visitor who knew nothing of geology and everything of mythology could be forgiven for thinking they had wandered into a deliberately arranged garden of the old gods. The formations are natural. Nobody seriously disputes that wind and water carved them over countless ages. The question that lingers is only about the labels, and about why the men holding the pens reached so consistently for the language of buried empires when they could just as easily have named these stones for presidents, rivers, or themselves. Now, the conventional explanation for all of this is fairly simple, and it deserves to be heard. In the late 1800s, the men surveying and describing the canyon were classically educated. They had read about Egypt and India and Persia. They looked at these immense flat-topped temple-shaped mountains and reached for the grandest vocabulary they had. A geologist named Clarence Dutton is usually credited with starting the tradition, and others followed his lead for decades. The names, in this telling, are poetry. They tell you about the education of the namers, not about anything buried in the rock. That is the accepted answer, and there is real evidence for it. But the people who lean toward the other interpretation ask a quieter question. Why these names? Why, out of every grand reference available, did the canyon end up dressed almost entirely in the imagery of lost ancient empires? Why Egypt and the East specifically, the very civilizations the 1909 article would later claim, were physically represented in a cave nearby? Coincidence is a perfectly good answer until the coincidences start clustering. And in the story of the Grand Canyon, they cluster more than anyone is comfortable admitting. So hold those names in your mind. Isis, Osiris, Buddha. We are going to come back to them, because they are about to stop feeling like poetry. Let's go to the article itself. On the 5th of April 1909, the Arizona Gazette ran a long piece under a dramatic headline about explorations in the Grand Canyon and discoveries that pointed to ancient people, migration from the East, and a possible link to a civilization from across the world. The story centered on a man it called G.E. Kincaid, described as an explorer and adventurer who, the paper said, was funded in part by the Smithsonian Institution. According to the report, Kincaid had been traveling down the Colorado River when he noticed staining on the rock high up a cliff face, and chisel marks that did not look natural. What he supposedly found, after climbing to it, was a tunnel entrance. Not a cave worn by water, but a passage cut by hands. The article described it stretching back into the rock for what it claimed was nearly a mile, with side chambers branching off a central hall like ribs off a spine. In those chambers, the report said, were artifacts unlike anything associated with the local tribes. Copper implements hardened by some lost process. Statues seated in the posture of Eastern gods. A figure, the paper, compared to depictions of Buddha. Hieroglyphic-style markings on the walls. Granary rooms with seeds still inside. And, in the most unsettling passages, references to what may have been crypts, suggesting the place had been used to house the dead. Read it today, and the article practically begs you not to believe it. It is florid, it is sensational. It names a sponsor that would later deny everything. And the explorer, at its center, is a man for whom researchers have struggled to find any independent paper trail at all. No clear birth record tied to the canyon story, no expedition logs, no photographs of the artifacts that supposedly filled an entire underground complex. For a discovery that the article itself called priceless and world-changing, the evidence that survived is almost nothing. To a careful skeptic, that absence is the whole answer. A newspaper in 1909 printed a tall tale to sell papers, the way newspapers often did, and the story took on a life it never earned. And yet, the story refuses to die, and the reasons it refuses are more interesting than the article itself. Because when researchers later wrote to the Smithsonian asking about Kincaid and about a colleague the article mentioned, the response they reported receiving was a flat denial. No record of the men, no record of the expedition, no artifacts in the collection. Now, for most stories, a clean denial closes the case. But for this story, the denial became fuel. Because the Smithsonian has a complicated reputation among the people who chase these threads, and that reputation is the bridge that carries us out of one strange article and into a much bigger theory. To understand that theory, you have to understand the accusation that sits underneath an entire genre of this research. For more than a century, there have been claims that institutions like the Smithsonian received unusual finds from across the American continent and made them disappear. Reports from 19th century local newspapers describing oversized skeletons in burial mounds, strange inscriptions on stones, structures that did not fit the accepted timeline. The mainstream view is that these reports were exaggerations, misidentifications, hoaxes, and the ordinary confusion of an era before professional archaeology. The alternative view treats them as a pattern of inconvenient evidence that was quietly filed away because it did not match the story the country had decided to tell about itself. You do not have to choose a side to see why. If you already believed the second version, the 1909 Grand Canyon article would feel less like a hoax and more like a leak. And the Grand Canyon is not the only place these threads gather. The same community of researchers points to the great earthen mounds of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, to strange stone chambers tucked into the hills of New England, to inscriptions carved on desert rock that do not match any script anyone expects to find there. Most of these have ordinary explanations, and many have been studied to exhaustion and explained. A few remain genuinely debated, even among careful scholars. The alternative researchers tend to sweep all of it into one pile, the solved and the unsolved together, and present the whole pile as a single body of proof. That is the move that frustrates historians the most, because it treats a settled question and an open one as if they carried the same weight. But it is also, in fairness, the move that keeps the story alive. A theory that used only its strongest evidence would be a much smaller theory, and a far easier one to set down and walk away from. This is where the Havasupai return to the center of the story, and where the year in our title finally matters. Because the canyon was never empty. Whatever was or was not in that cliff, there were people living in and around that landscape who had their own accounts of who came before them. And the question the alternative researchers keep circling is simple. What did the oldest residents of the Grand Canyon actually remember? Not what the newspapers said, not what the surveyors named the rocks. What did the elders know, and why were they so reluctant to share it? The Havasupai, like many peoples of the Southwest, carried oral traditions that reached back through a flood. In the broad shape of the story, the world before was destroyed by rising water, and the people who survived did so by sheltering inside the canyon or by being led to safety through it. After the waters fell, the survivors emerged into a changed world and began again. Versions of a great flood appear in the traditions of cultures all around the planet, which the conventional view explains as the natural result of humans everywhere remembering real local floods, river surges, and rising seas at the end of the last ice age. But the alternative researchers hear something more specific in the southwestern versions. They hear the canyon described not as a place the people stumbled into, but as a structure that protected them, a refuge that was already there. And they note, with some justification, that the Havasupai never treated the canyon as a wilderness to be conquered or a frontier to be tamed. They treated it as home, as kin, as a place with its own long memory. To people who relate to a landscape that way, the line between a natural shelter and a built one was never as sharp as it became for the outsiders who arrived later with their maps, their categories, and their need to file everything as either made by hands or made by chance. And then there is the detail that gives this whole episode its name. According to the accounts that circulate in this research, when ethnographers and collectors began pressing the Havasupai elders in the late 1800s about the deepest layers of their tradition, about the beings and the builders who came before the flood, the elders went quiet. They would share songs, place names, the recent history, the practical knowledge of the land, but about certain things, the oldest things, they reportedly would not speak to outsiders at all. It was treated as sacred, or as dangerous, or as simply not for the ears of strangers who had come to take rather than to listen. The claim that anchors our title is that this silence held until 1894, when one elder, at the end of a long life, finally allowed a fragment of it to be written down. Now, I want to be honest with you about what that 1894 claim is and is not. It is not a document you can pull from a federal archive with a stamp on it. It lives in the borderland of oral history, second-hand accounts, and the retellings that pass through this community of researchers. The skeptic will say it is a date attached to a story to make it feel solid, and the skeptic might be right. But even if you set the exact year aside, the underlying pattern is real and well documented. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Indigenous peoples across North America did hold back their sacred knowledge from the surveyors and collectors of that era, and for good reason. They had watched outsiders take their land, their water, their children, and their objects. Why would they hand over their oldest stories to the same people? The silence is not a mystery. The silence is a completely rational response to a century of loss. What the alternative researchers do is take that very real silence and ask what, specifically, was being protected. It helps to picture who was actually doing the asking in those years, because the 1890s were a strange and intense moment for this kind of collecting. A wave of ethnographers, government men, museum agents, and amateur enthusiasts fanned out across the Southwest with notebooks and early cameras, convinced that the native cultures were vanishing and that their knowledge had to be captured before it was gone forever. They recorded songs. They copied designs off pottery and blankets. They bought sacred objects, sometimes for a few dollars, sometimes by pressure. And they pushed elders for the deepest layers of their cosmology, the parts that were never meant for outside ears. From inside a Havasupai village, this must have looked exactly like what it was. Strangers carrying the backing of a powerful government, arriving to extract whatever could be carried out. Some elders cooperated, some told partial truths, some said nothing at all. And in that climate, the idea that one elder might finally, near the end of a long life in 1894, decide to release a single guarded fragment to one trusted listener is not far-fetched. It is exactly how oral knowledge tends to move when a culture senses its time is running short. So what fills that silence in their telling? This is where the theory expands from one canyon into a vision of the entire world, and where the economic angle finally comes into focus. Because the people who study the Grand Canyon's tunnels rarely stop at the Grand Canyon. They connect it to a much larger idea, one that has spread widely in recent years under a single strange name, Tartaria. The Tartaria theory, in its broadest form, proposes that the standard timeline of human history is wrong in a specific way. It suggests there was once a vast, advanced, globe-spanning civilization, far older and far more capable than we are taught, and that this civilization was erased. Not just defeated, but scrubbed, its achievements reassigned to later builders, its records destroyed or hidden, its very name reduced to a half-forgotten label on old maps. The name itself comes from real geography. For centuries, European maps marked a huge stretch of Central and East Asia as Tartary, a catch-all term for lands and peoples the mapmakers did not fully understand. The theory takes that real cartographic ghost and reimagines it as the faint signature of the lost empire. The believers point to several kinds of evidence, and to follow the Grand Canyon story you need to know the shape of their argument. First, they point to architecture. The grand old buildings of the 19th century, the World's Fair palaces, the ornate train stations, the courthouses and exhibition halls, covered in detail that no modern budget would attempt. They ask how a supposedly poor, sparsely populated, recently settled country threw up so many cathedrals of stone and iron in a few short decades, and then tore most of them down almost as fast. Second, they point to the World's Fairs themselves, those enormous temporary cities of white domes and towers that appeared in the late 1800s and were demolished within a year or two. The official story says these were built cheaply, of plaster over wood frames, for spectacle. The theory asks whether they were demolitions of something older, repurposed and then erased, rather than constructions of something new. Third, And this is the piece that matters most for our story. They point to what they call the mud flood. The claim is that across many old cities around the world, you can find buildings whose ground floors sit oddly low, with windows half buried below street level, as if the original first story had been swallowed by earth. The conventional explanation is ordinary and well understood. Cities raise their streets over time to deal with sewage, flooding, and grading, burying lower floors in the process, and the architectural styles that look impossibly ornate were simply the products of skilled, poorly paid labour that the modern economy no longer supports. But the theory reads the same evidence as the residue of a catastrophe, a wave of mud and water that buried a previous world, leaving its survivors to dig out, rebuild on top, and forget. And once you are holding the idea of a buried previous world, a canyon full of cut tunnels and Egyptian idols stops looking like an isolated hoax. It starts looking like one more place where the old world poked through. This is also where the revisionist economic history comes in, because the theory is, at its heart, an argument about who built the wealth of the modern world and who got the credit. The standard story of the 19th century is a story of explosive growth. A young nation, a flood of immigrants, railroads stitching a continent together, factories multiplying, fortunes made from steel and oil and rail. The alternative reading looks at the same century and asks a set of awkward questions. How did the infrastructure appear so fast? Where did the workforce come from for the scale of stonework on display? And what about the orphans? That last question is one of the theory's stranger and more emotionally charged threads. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, an enormous number of children moved through the orphan systems of the industrializing world, and in the United States, hundreds of thousands of them were loaded onto what became known as the orphan trains and distributed across the country. The official history explains this as the tragic result of poverty, disease, immigration, and cities that could not care for their poorest. The theory hears something colder in those numbers. It asks why there were suddenly so many parentless children all at once, and it ties that wave of orphans to its imagined catastrophe. A reset, in which the previous population was largely wiped out, leaving a generation of children to be gathered up, redistributed, and raised inside a new story that did not include the world their parents came from. It is a dark and frankly unprovable claim, but it shows you what the theory is really doing. It is taking the documented strangeness of that era, the orphans, the demolished palaces, the buried floors, and weaving it into a single narrative of loss and replacement. And there is a piece of the Grand Canyon's own economic history that the theory loves to chew on, because it is real and it is abrupt. For most of the 19th century, reaching the canyon meant a brutal journey by wagon or mule across high desert, a trip so punishing that only the most determined travelers ever attempted it. Then, in a remarkably short window, around the turn of the century, that changed completely. The railroad arrived. The Santa Fe line pushed a spur right up to the south rim, and almost overnight the canyon went from a place of legendary inaccessibility to a destination with a grand hotel perched on its very edge. The El Tovar, built of dark timber and local stone, rose at the rim like something that had always belonged there. A polished tourism operation, the Fred Harvey Company, moved in to feed and house the crowds that the trains delivered. To the ordinary historian, this is a clean and well-documented story of capital and rail meeting scenery at exactly the moment America fell in love with its own wild places. To the alternative researcher, the sheer speed of it raises the same question they raise everywhere. How does a remote gorge in the middle of the desert acquire, in just a handful of years, the full infrastructure of a polished resort, complete with masonry that still stands a century later? They are not always wrong to be impressed by what was built. They are usually wrong about who built it and when. Bring all of that back to the rim of the Grand Canyon and the pieces snap into a particular shape. A canyon whose interior is named, again and again, for the gods of Egypt and the East. A 1909 article describing a tunnel complex filled with the artifacts of exactly those civilizations. A great institution that denied the whole thing the moment it was asked. And a native people whose elders, by these accounts, guarded knowledge of an older world so carefully that it took until 1894 for even a fragment to slip out. To the believer, this is not a string of unrelated curiosities. It is a single story told 4 times in 4 different ways. The rocks remember, the article remembers, the denial protects, the elders knew. I want to slow down here, because this is the moment where it would be easy to lose the thread between what is documented and what is imagined, and you deserve to keep both in view. So let's separate them cleanly. What is genuinely real is this. The Grand Canyon's interior formations really do carry the names of ancient gods, and you can verify that on any detailed map. The 1909 Arizona Gazette article really was printed, and you can read it in newspaper archives. Indigenous peoples of the region really did hold flood traditions, and really did withhold sacred knowledge from outsiders during exactly the decades in question. Those are facts. They are strange, and they are true. What is not established is everything that connects those facts into a conspiracy. There is no verified tunnel, no surviving Egyptian statue from the canyon sitting in any collection. No confirmed explorer, named Kincaid, with a documented expedition. No proven order from any institution to bury evidence of a lost civilization. And the broader Tartaria theory, the mud flood, the reset, the orphan replacement, runs hard against the enormous, boring, well-evidenced weight of ordinary history. Cities really do raise their streets. Skilled stonework really was cheaper, when labour was cheaper and treated worse. World's fairs really were temporary by design. The flood stories really can be explained by humans everywhere, remembering real water. None of that requires a vanished empire. So why does the story still grip people the way it does? Part of the answer is the genuine gaps. History is not a sealed box. There are real silences in the record, real things the powerful did bury, real injustices done to native peoples whose knowledge was taken or ignored. When you have lived through enough official stories that turned out to be incomplete, a theory that says the whole timeline is a cover begins to feel less like fantasy and more like pattern recognition. And part of the answer is simpler and more human. The idea that we are the descendants of something greater, something lost, something deliberately hidden, is one of the oldest and most comforting stories there is. It turns a confusing world into a mystery with a solution, and it puts you on the side of the people brave enough to look. But I think there is a third reason this particular story holds, and it is the one that actually deserves our respect. Underneath all the Egyptian idols and buried empires, this story keeps circling back to a real and serious truth. The Havasupai and the peoples like them really were the keepers of deep knowledge about that land. They really did watch outsiders arrive, rename their world, claim their canyon, and write their history for them. They really did decide, wisely, that some things were not for sale and not for sharing. The tragedy the theory dresses up in fantasy is a real tragedy. Knowledge was lost, voices were silenced. Stories that should have been recorded with care were instead pressed out of people who had every reason to stay quiet. You do not need a vanished super-civilization to find a genuine cover-up in the history of the American Southwest. The slower, sadder cover-up was the ordinary one. It was the erasure of the people who were already there. So what do we make of the elders, who reportedly would not speak until 1894? Maybe the most honest answer is the one that respects the silence instead of trying to break it. Maybe what they were protecting was never a tunnel full of foreign gods. Maybe it was something more valuable and more fragile than that. A way of understanding the canyon as a living place, a center, a refuge, a relative, rather than a riddle to be solved or a vault to be looted. And maybe the reason the outside world keeps inventing tunnels and empires under the Grand Canyon is that it cannot quite accept the simpler, stranger truth sitting in plain sight. That the people who knew this place best were here first, knew more than they ever told us, and chose, deliberately, to keep some of it. The 1909 article will keep circulating. The temple names will keep sitting on the map, half poetry and half provocation. The Tartaria theory will keep gathering the strange edges of the 19th century into its quiet story of a buried world. And somewhere down in that blue-green canyon, the water will keep falling over the same stone it has fallen over for longer than any of our stories go back. Whatever the Havasupai elders refused to say, and whatever fragment finally slipped loose in 1894, the canyon is still holding most of it. It always has. That may be the only part of this entire story that everyone, believer and skeptic alike, can finally agree is true.